Cleopatra. The name alone evokes visions of gold, power, seduction, and tragedy. For more than 2,000 years, she has been remembered as one of the most iconic women in history, a queen whose beauty and cunning could shake the foundations of empires. Yet behind the Hollywood myth and romanticized legends lies the real story of Egypt's last pharaoh, a woman born into a dynasty already in decline, who dared to stand against the unstoppable might of Rome. This is not merely the story of a queen. It is the story of an empire at the edge of collapse. It is a tale of political intrigue, betrayal, and alliances forged through love and ambition. Cleopatra VII Philopator was the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with her death, more than 3,000 years of pharaohs came to an end. And yet, her image has refused to fade into the sands of history. Across centuries, artists, poets, and filmmakers have reimagined her, sometimes as a goddess of beauty, other times as a ruthless seductress. But who is the real Cleopatra? What truths lie hidden beneath the layers of myth? And can archaeology ever reveal the secrets of her lost tomb? In this documentary, we will journey back through time. We will explore Cleopatra's rise to power, her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her defiance of Rome, and the enduring mystery surrounding her death. This is the full biography of Cleopatra, Egypt's last pharaoh, and the woman who defied an empire. To understand Cleopatra, we must first step back into the world she was born into. Egypt in the 1st century BCE was no longer the mighty empire of the great pharaohs. The pyramids of Giza had already stood for more than 2,000 years, ancient monuments fading under the desert sun. The land of the Nile was now ruled not by native Egyptians, but by a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Ptolemaic rulers styled themselves as pharaohs, draping their image in Egyptian tradition, yet their bloodline was purely Macedonian Greek. They spoke Greek, lived by Greek customs, and governed Egypt as outsiders who sat upon a borrowed throne. Within their royal palaces of Alexandria, the great port city founded by Alexander himself, the Ptolemies ruled with both splendor and corruption, clinging to power through intrigue, incestuous marriages, and ruthless rivalries. It was into this world of decadence and decline that Cleopatra VII was born in the year 69 BCE. She was a daughter of King Ptolemy XII, a ruler despised by many of his subjects for squandering Egypt's wealth on bribes to secure Rome's favor. Her mother's identity is still a matter of debate. Some believe she was Cleopatra VI. Others argue she may have been a concubine of Egyptian descent. What is certain is that Cleopatra was raised in a dynasty where siblings often became rivals, where family loyalty was rare, and survival demanded both intelligence and ruthlessness. Unlike most of her predecessors, Cleopatra would distinguish herself in an extraordinary way. She was one of the few Ptolemaic rulers who embraced Egyptian culture. While her ancestors relied on Greek language and customs, Cleopatra became fluent not only in Greek, but also in Egyptian, along with several other tongues spoken across the eastern Mediterranean. This ability to speak directly to her people marked her as different, a queen who could bridge two worlds, the Greek ruling elite and the ancient traditions of Egypt. From the moment of her birth, Cleopatra's destiny was entwined with both greatness and danger. She was a child of the Nile, heir to a throne surrounded by enemies both within her family and far beyond Egypt's borders. And as Rome's shadow grew longer across the Mediterranean, the survival of her dynasty would depend on the wit and will of this remarkable young girl. From her earliest years, Cleopatra was immersed in a world where knowledge was power. Growing up in the royal palaces of Alexandria, she was surrounded by one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever known. The city boasted the legendary Library of Alexandria, a vast treasure trove of scrolls and texts collected from across the Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, this was not just a backdrop, it was her classroom. Unlike many rulers of her time, Cleopatra was not content with ceremonial training. She pursued an education that rivaled the finest minds of Greece. Skilled tutors instructed her in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. She studied the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, mastering the intellectual traditions of both Greek and Egyptian cultures. This deep learning would later shape her reputation, not merely as a queen of beauty, but as a ruler of intellect. What made Cleopatra truly remarkable was her mastery of languages. Ancient historians record that she spoke as many as 9 tongues, from Greek and Egyptian to Hebrew, Aramaic, and even the languages of distant African kingdoms. This gift allowed her to communicate directly with foreign emissaries without interpreters, a rare ability that gave her a commanding presence in diplomacy. At the same time, she was trained in the art of politics, a necessity in a family where siblings often became enemies. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, the throne was not inherited peacefully. It was seized, defended, and often drenched in blood. From a young age, Cleopatra would have witnessed the whispers of court intrigue, the rivalries between brothers and sisters, and the dangers that came with ambition. Yet she was not raised in seclusion. Cleopatra traveled the Nile with her father, Ptolemy XII, observing both the grandeur of Egypt's temples and the hardships of its people. She saw the contrast between the wealth of Alexandria's palaces and the poverty of farmers who toiled under heavy taxation. These journeys gave her insight into the land she would one day rule, not only as a monarch sheltered in luxury, but as a queen aware of her people's struggles. In her youth, Cleopatra sharpened both her mind and her instincts. She understood that survival in her dynasty required more than just a claim to the throne. It demanded intelligence, charm, and above all, the ability to outwit rivals. The education she received in Alexandria prepared her for more than leadership. It prepared her for survival in one of the most treacherous dynasties in history. By the time Cleopatra entered her teenage years, Egypt was already drowning in political turmoil. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak and unpopular king, mocked by his people and reliant on Rome to keep his crown. He drained Egypt's treasury to bribe Roman officials, leaving his kingdom unstable and his throne precarious. When he was forced into exile, Cleopatra, still a young girl, was left behind in Alexandria, a witness to the fragile grip her dynasty held on power. In 51 BCE, when Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra ascended to the throne at the age of just 18. But as tradition demanded, she did not rule alone. By law, she was forced to co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. In name, they were equals. In reality, Cleopatra was the true power. She signed decrees in her own name, placed her portrait on coins, and positioned herself as the rightful pharaoh of Egypt. This boldness, however, quickly turned her brother's advisors against her. The royal court became a battlefield of influence, where generals, priests, and courtiers schemed to push the young king forward and cast Cleopatra aside. Soon, the palace whispers turned into open hostility. Cleopatra found herself stripped of authority, her name erased from official documents. By 48 BCE, she was forced to flee Alexandria, taking refuge in the deserts of Syria. But Cleopatra was not a woman to surrender. In exile, she began to gather support, raising an army of mercenaries who were loyal not to her brother, but to her. She understood that Egypt's throne could not be reclaimed by waiting. It had to be fought for. And as fate would have it, the chaos of Rome would soon bring one of history's most powerful men directly into her life. That man was Julius Caesar. At the very moment Cleopatra plotted her return, Caesar arrived in Alexandria, chasing his rival Pompey during Rome's bloody civil war. Egypt, a kingdom already torn by sibling rivalry, was about to become the stage on which Cleopatra would make her most daring gamble. When Julius Caesar stepped into Alexandria in 48 BCE, he was at the height of his power, but also in the midst of crisis. Rome was divided by civil war, and Caesar sought Egypt's wealth to secure his position. For Cleopatra, this was not a threat. It was an opportunity. If she could win Caesar's support, She could reclaim her throne from her brother and re-establish herself as Egypt's true ruler. But getting to Caesar was no simple task. Alexandria was under the control of Ptolemaic II's advisors, who would have executed Cleopatra the moment she set foot in the palace. To outwit them, she devised one of the most daring entrances in history. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled inside a carpet, or, as some historians believe, a linen sack. When unrolled before the Roman general, the young queen appeared, not as a prisoner, but as a bold ruler staking her claim to the throne. The gamble worked. Caesar was captivated by her intelligence, her presence, and her charm. Unlike many who had dismissed Cleopatra as a powerless exile, Caesar saw her ambition and recognized her as the ally he needed in Egypt. Their relationship quickly became both political and personal. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra returned to power. War soon followed. Caesar's Roman legions clashed with the forces of Ptolemy XIII in what became known as the Alexandrian War. Amid the chaos, parts of Alexandria were set ablaze, and the legendary Library of Alexandria may have suffered its greatest destruction. By the end of the conflict, Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee. Cleopatra, now firmly backed by Rome, was restored to the throne. To secure the dynasty, she entered into another co-rule, this time with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. But unlike before, there was no question of who held the power. Cleopatra ruled as Egypt's sole authority, and with Caesar at her side, her position was unshakable. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra bore a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Though Rome never officially acknowledged the child, Cleopatra declared him the son of Julius Caesar himself. With this child, she sought to bind the destiny of Egypt to the greatest empire of its age. Yet their union was more than personal ambition. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar to Rome, where she stayed in one of his villas, astonishing the Roman elite with her presence. Draped in jewels and gold, she represented not only Egypt's wealth, but also its independence. A foreign queen who had captivated their most powerful general. For some Romans, she was a symbol of luxury and decadence. For others, she was a dangerous reminder that Caesar's loyalty was not solely to Rome. But fate, once again, would turn against her. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, stabbed to death by senators who feared his growing power. For Cleopatra, it was not only the loss of her most powerful ally, but the collapse of everything she had built in Rome. With her son in tow, she fled back to Egypt, where she would once again face an uncertain future. After the death of Julius Caesar, Rome was thrown once again into chaos. The empire fractured into rival factions, each led by ambitious men seeking to claim Caesar's mantle. Among them was Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, a brilliant general, a charismatic statesman, and a man whose destiny would forever intertwine with Cleopatra's. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. Officially, he demanded her loyalty and financial support in Rome's ongoing wars. But Cleopatra, ever the strategist, saw more than just a summons. She saw an opportunity to form a new alliance, one that could secure Egypt's independence and elevate her place on the world stage. When Cleopatra arrived in Tarsus, she did not come meekly. Ancient writers tell us that she sailed up the river Cydnus on a golden barge, its sails of purple silk billowing in the wind, its oars of silver flashing in the sun. Cleopatra herself was dressed as the goddess Isis, reclining beneath a canopy of gold. Musicians played, incense burned, and the people of Tarsus whispered in awe. It was not just an entrance, it was a declaration. Cleopatra had not come to bow to Rome, but to meet Antony as an equal. Antony, known for his love of spectacle, was enthralled. What began as a political negotiation quickly transformed into something deeper. The two became lovers, and Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where the pair embarked on a whirlwind romance. Together, They hosted lavish banquets, paraded through the streets as gods, and presented themselves not as conqueror and subject, but as king and queen of a new, united destiny. Yet behind the romance lay political calculation. Cleopatra needed Antony's power to protect Egypt from Roman domination, and Antony needed Cleopatra's immense wealth to finance his campaigns. Their union was both passion and pragmatism, sealed by shared ambition. In time, Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. She envisioned them not just as heirs to Egypt, but as rulers of a vast Eastern empire, a dynasty that could rival Rome itself. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra even staged ceremonies in which their children were granted royal titles over lands Rome had not yet conquered. But these ambitions alarmed Rome. To the Roman Senate, Antony was no longer their general. He was a man bewitched by an Egyptian queen. Propaganda spread rapidly, portraying Cleopatra as a manipulative seductress, a foreign temptress who had ensnared Antony and threatened Rome's supremacy. For Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's rival, this was the perfect weapon. He declared that Antony had betrayed Rome, surrendering his loyalty to Cleopatra. The stage was set for one of the most legendary confrontations in history: Rome versus Egypt, Octavian versus Antony and Cleopatra. And at the heart of it all, a love affair that defied empires. By the late 30s BCE, the bond between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was no longer a private affair. It was a political crisis shaking the foundations of Rome. Their union symbolized, to many Romans, not love, but treachery. Cleopatra was depicted as the foreign queen who had bewitched one of Rome's greatest generals, and Antony was accused of abandoning his Roman identity for an Egyptian crown. Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and Antony's fiercest rival, seized upon this perception. A master of propaganda, Octavian launched a campaign portraying Antony as a traitor who sought to make Alexandria the capital of a new empire. He claimed Cleopatra had ensnared him with luxury, that he had become her puppet, and that together they plotted against Rome itself. This was not just slander, it was a declaration of war. In 32 BCE, the Roman Senate, swayed by Octavian, stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not against him directly, but against Cleopatra. This clever maneuver framed the conflict as a defense of Rome against a foreign enemy, rather than a civil war between Romans. For Cleopatra, the battle ahead was not only for her throne, but for the survival of Egypt itself. The decisive clash came in 31 BCE at Actium, a naval battle off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet, funded by Egypt's immense wealth, and initially, their forces outnumbered Octavian's. But Octavian had 2 key advantages: the brilliant naval commander Agrippa and the loyalty of Rome's legions. On the day of battle, the sea turned into chaos. Ships rammed one another, arrows darkened the skies, and the clash of metal rang across the waters. For hours, Antony's fleet held strong. But then, in a move that has baffled historians for centuries, Cleopatra's ships suddenly broke formation and fled. Some accounts suggest she panicked, others that her strategy had always been to retreat and preserve her fleet. Whatever the reason, Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned the fight and followed her with his remaining ships. It was a disastrous decision. Without their leaders, Antony's forces collapsed, and Octavian claimed a decisive victory. The Battle of Actium was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of the end for both Antony and Cleopatra. Their dream of a shared empire crumbled in a single day, and their enemies in Rome now stood unstoppable. Defeated, Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria, preparing for the final chapter of their lives. For the first time, the queen who had once outwitted generals and emperors now found herself cornered, her kingdom facing the full might of Rome. In the aftermath of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, But the city that had once been the jewel of the Mediterranean now stood on the brink of collapse. Octavian's forces closed in, and the dream of an Eastern empire was in ruins. Yet, even in defeat, Cleopatra did not surrender. She began securing Egypt's vast treasures, moving gold, silver, and grain into hidden vaults. If she could not defeat Rome in battle, she would ensure that Egypt's wealth did not fall easily into Roman hands. Antony, however, was broken. Once one of Rome's most formidable generals, he now saw himself mocked by propaganda and abandoned by allies. His armies melted away, and his honor lay in tatters. As Octavian's legions advanced into Egypt in 30 BC, Antony prepared for a last stand. But the battle for Alexandria was swift, and his forces crumbled. It was then that Antony received the news that shattered him completely. Cleopatra was dead. Believing the love of his life had taken her own life, Antony fell upon his sword. Gravely wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he discovered the truth: she was still alive. In her arms, Antony breathed his last, his final words declaring his love and loyalty to the queen who had defined his destiny. Cleopatra was now alone. With Antony gone and Octavian's legions at her gates, she was left with one final choice: submission or death. Octavian, now master of Rome, demanded her surrender. Some sources claim she considered parading herself as a captive in his triumph. But Cleopatra, the queen who had ruled as a living goddess, would not allow herself to be humiliated. In August of 30 BCE, Cleopatra retreated into her tomb, dressed in her royal robes of gold and crimson, adorned with her finest jewels. There, according to ancient accounts, she arranged for an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, to be smuggled in a basket of figs. Allowing the serpent to strike, Cleopatra ended her life in the most dramatic fashion possible. Not as a prisoner of Rome, but as Egypt's last true pharaoh. When Octavian entered the tomb, he found her lifeless body, serene in death, her attendants lying beside her, also poisoned. The image of Cleopatra, the queen who defied emperors and loved as fiercely as she ruled, became immortal in legend. Octavian would later become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, but his greatest rival would forever be remembered not as a conqueror, but as a woman whose brilliance, ambition, and tragic end outshone even Rome's might. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt fell to Rome, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended after nearly 3 centuries of rule. The age of pharaohs was over, and the sands of the Nile now belonged to the empire. But Cleopatra herself never truly died. Her story lived on, inspiring poets, historians, and artists for centuries to come. Cleopatra's death marked the end of more than just her reign. It was the end of an era. With her passing, Egypt lost its independence and became a province of the Roman Empire. The Nile, once the lifeblood of a proud civilization that had built pyramids and empires, was now under foreign rule. Yet while Rome controlled Egypt's land, it could never truly claim Cleopatra's legacy. For centuries after her death, Roman writers painted Cleopatra as a seductress, a temptress who lured powerful men to their doom. Octavian's propaganda, crafted to justify his war, survived long after him, shaping her image as a dangerous woman rather than a brilliant ruler. But behind the slander lies the truth of a queen who spoke multiple languages, who was a shrewd diplomat, and who ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world with intelligence and vision. In the centuries that followed, her legend grew. To the Arabs of the Middle Ages, Cleopatra was remembered as a philosopher and scientist, a woman of wisdom who studied medicine and alchemy. During the Renaissance, she became a muse for artists, poets, and playwrights, immortalized by Shakespeare, painted by masters, and celebrated as the embodiment of passion and power. Even in modern times, Cleopatra's story continues to captivate the world. She remains one of history's most enduring icons, not just for her beauty or her romances with Caesar and Antony, but for her strength, her ambition, and her refusal to be diminished by the men who sought to control her. She was a queen who stood against the might of Rome, who dared to shape her own destiny, and whose death was as unforgettable as her life. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was more than a symbol of her age. She became a symbol for all ages. A woman who defied the limits of power, who lived and died on her own terms, and who left behind a legacy that has outlasted empires. More than 2,000 years later, her name still resonates, reminding us that while kingdoms rise and fall, true legends never fade. Cleopatra's death was not just the end of a queen. It marked the fall of Egypt's independence and the dawn of Rome's dominance. Her name lives on, not only as a woman of beauty, but as a ruler of intelligence, ambition, and unshakable will. More than 2,000 years later, her story remains a mirror of power, love, and tragedy, a legacy carved into the sands of history. If you enjoyed this journey through Cleopatra's world, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe for more untold stories of the past. Your support helps us bring forgotten history back to life.